Hello. The Divine Code reading for November 18th, pages 327 and 328. We are in the chapter Maimed or Broken Limbs. That's maimed or broken limbs of animals that are to be consumed as meat after they're dead. Topic number 9. The flesh that is available to cover a broken or protruding bone. We're in an area discussing if a bone is broken and it's protruding out of the skin, out of the flesh, so it's coming out of the animal's body. And the question is whether or not it can be used. The limb that the bone is attached with can be used for consumption after the animal dies. And there's a difference of opinion, and the accepted opinion is that it can be used even if it's broken, and considered like a hanging limb. But there's some opinions that say it cannot be used, and therefore we're looking regarding opinions where there's question about it. What would be the absolute everyone would agree with versus where the controversies are. So the flesh that is available to cover a broken or protruding bone must be healthy and largely contiguous. If, by contrast, there would be no large mass of flesh around the replaced bone, it is not acceptable if the flesh has one of the following conditions. So what it's describing here is when a bone is protruding out. If the bone is reset, the best the veterinarian can reset the bone. When he resets the bone, is there enough flesh around it? It has to be the majority of the bone has to be covered with flesh in order for it to be considered still a full limb versus a hanging limb where there's a controversy about. So it is not acceptable if the flesh is one of the following conditions. A, it is in many small pieces around the bone. That is, when one would calculate the entire amount of flesh to come up with the 50% or more than 51%, it would be large enough to cover the greater portion of the bone. Nevertheless, it is not located in large sections, but instead is made up of many pieces. So there's like chunks of flesh here and there left over by whatever accident caused the animal to have a broken bone, a protruding broken bone. There's chunks of meat, but they're not connected to each other. You can't just push it back together and say it would work. B, the other condition, it is very thin or separated from the bone. So except in the case of a knee, which we were discussing yesterday, where there's not really much flesh or any flesh there to begin with, it's where there should be flesh, it's separated from the bone in such a way that it's not, it's just a flap kind of laying out there, but it's not something that can really be counted properly. They're trying to determine what parts of meat would be counted towards the 51%. And these are excluded. C, it is perforated or slit in many places. So this would be a case where you got the meat. It's still kind of connected, but it's ripped apart in such a way that even though it's there, I mean, it's together in one piece, but it's ripped apart in such a way that it would not be recognizable as something you'd expect to find in a living animal. D, it is crushed or decayed like flesh, which a doctor would remove. So it's smushed up meat. It's not the accident that caused or it's associated with the bone that's broken. So whatever caused the bone to be broken, it's got smushed up meat. Considered a living animal at that, meat of a living animal at that point. Or if it's decayed, that means that it's dying. It's got gangrene. A doctor would remove that. A veterinarian would remove that flesh from the animal. That's not something that would be, it has to be flesh that's recognizable as usable flesh to go around the animal's bone after when it's set, in order to get the 50% where it would be considered a fixable limb versus a hanging limb. In these cases, the flesh is not considered as a covering for the broken bone. Rambam, The Laws of Forbidden Foods, 5.8, Shulchan Aruch Yoreh De'ah, 55.10. Similarly, in any instance where a doctor, when they say a doctor, they mean veterinarian, would say that the bone would not heal, it is forbidden according to the stricter opinion. It's implied from Rima Yoreh De'ah, 55.10, I assume. So when they say the stricter opinion, the majority opinion, which is the halakha that we go with, would say that even a hanging limb would be acceptable as long as it's not detached. It's not considered a limb from a living animal that was detached from a living animal, and therefore, after the animal slaughtered, the whole question is, after the animal slaughtered, would this limb be acceptable? So the majority opinion says that it would be acceptable. The minority opinion, which is the Rambam, says it would not be acceptable. And several pages in the Divine Code is dedicated to understanding the Rambam's position, even though it's not the accepted position. So according to the stricter position, this animal would not be, if the bone cannot be reset. In other words, at some point in time, is the animal going to be able to walk on the leg after the accident and after it heals from the accident? The question is whether or not, if the animal can walk on the leg at some point and it'll be functional, even if it limps, or walk on that leg and it's going to flop over because the bone never healed. That's the question here. If, despite its initial condition, flesh regenerated and can now cover the majority of the thickness and circumference of the broken and protruding bone, the limb is acceptable. Rambam, Laws of Forbidden Foods, 5.8. So if the animal does not have the 50% covering over the bone, if it's slaughtered at that point, it would not be acceptable according to the Rambam, even though the majority opinion would say it would be acceptable. But according to the Rambam, it would not be acceptable. Meat, instead of being slaughtered right away, it waits a year, and the flesh gets better. The flesh regenerates. However, that works with animals. The flesh regenerates, and now it's getting better. Now it covers the 50%, more than 50%. Then it would be considered acceptable if it's slaughtered at that time. Topic number 10. If an animal's limb was hanging or a bone was broken and protruding to the extent that it would have been forbidden, but it was repaired through surgery and healed. It is acceptable. Shulchan Uridea, 5512, Darki, Moshe, and Taz Uridea, chapter 62. For the reason that since it healed, it was living flesh during the entire time. Prohibition for Gentiles comes from separating flesh while the animal was still alive. It appears that it would be permitted to eat this type of injured limb after the animal dies. So it's again similar to the animal being allowed to regenerate some of its flesh. So now it covers up the limb in an acceptable manner, more than 50% manner. If veterinary science improves over time and can now repair the limb, it was all ripped up, and now veterinarians get involved, and they're able to repair the limb, considered limb from a living animal, because it was always alive. They can't repair a limb once the limb is dead. Therefore, as long as the limb is alive, they can repair it. And therefore, later on, if they slaughtered the animal, that limb would be considered part of the slaughtered animal. It wasn't removed. However, for an organ transplant from a living animal to another animal, or to a human, the transplanted organ will remain forbidden as Avermem Akai. So that's if they're going to reattach it to the original animal. If it's detached from the original animal and somewhere else, it's been detached from the living animal that it belonged to. So once it's detached, it's not on the limb. It's on the living of the animal and being attached to the living animal. So once it's detached to another living animal, the other living animal keeps the limb in a stasis of being alive, attached from its proper source. So it's permissible to use the detached limb. What's not permissible is to eat the detached limb, even if the new animal. I can't even imagine the halakhic questions about concerning if it's used for a human, but if it's used for an animal, which is more possible to follow, it's detached from the animal that's its source. That animal is still alive, at least at the time that it was detached. It's reattached to a new animal that's not its source. It's been grafted onto the new animal, and therefore it still retains the status of being separated from the living animal. If it was reattached to itself, to the original animal, that's what's talking about earlier. Well, it goes a little, that would be even a little bit further than the hanging limb that's repaired. If the limb is detached entirely and reattached to the living animal, in that case, this is discussed further on in the divine code, but at this point the question comes up, what would happen in that case? My guess, for all it's worth, would be that that limb would, if it's been reattached, would still be considered attached to the living animal. It's not detached. So later on, if that animal was slaughtered, the animal that originally belonged to, that was reattached to a slaughter, that would be acceptable limb. However, the animal that receives the transplant, the graft of another animal's limb, slaughtered, that limb would still be considered removed from the original animal and would retain the status of Aver Memakai, the limb detached from a living animal, and would be forbidden. That limb would be forbidden. The rest of the animal would be fine, but that limb would be forbidden. Topic number 11. There is a rabbinical opinion that maintains that a land mammal or a fowl, when a land mammal or fowl is killed through non-kosher mixed slaughter, in which the windpipe and gullet are slit, the lungs or the digestive tract organs are respectively forbidden for Gentiles as organs separated from a living animal. For since the windpipe or the gullet was slit, the lung or the digestive tract organs are, respectively, no longer considered attached to the body, but merely as contained within the body cavity. As in topic 2.5 above, see figure 2 below. There's a picture in tomorrow's reading. In tomorrow, topic 12 is tomorrow's reading. According to this opinion, the windpipe and esophagus themselves are also forbidden. That would be beyond anything beyond the cut. If the cut, esophagus and the windpipe, then anything beyond that within those systems would be considered limb, or it would be a limb detached. The organs and all that would be considered detached from the living animal. If the animal, it's just going to go into more detail about this. According to the opinion, the windpipe and esophagus themselves are also forbidden, and Aver Memakai applies to these organs. The prevailing rabbinic opinion, so this is a stricter opinion that says that the innards, organs of the animal that is detached through the slaughter cut, technically its slaughter cut causes those, that would be considered detached, a detached limb, because it was detached while the animal was in the convulsing stage. It's not considered dead. The animal's not considered dead. A Gentile does a slaughter. It's not considered dead until the animal stops until the heart stops, basically, is when the animal is considered dead. So that the neck cut to an animal, if it separates the organs beyond the neck cut, those organs would be considered limb from a living animal. However, the prevailing rabbinic opinion is that these organs are not considered as being separated from a living animal. And we have a footnote 109. Now, because of the questions I had regarding the transplant, I threw and noticed that there wasn't a lot of extra in footnote 108 concerning that. However, I also noticed at the time that footnote 109 continues for 6 pages in the Hebrew edition of the book. In the English edition of the book, which is what I'm reading from, the footnote is 2/3 of a page. So this footnote 109 is much longer in the Hebrew version of the book. So we're getting the synopsis here. even though it does continue for 2/3 of a page. There is a discussion among the sages in Tractate Chulin 33a as to whether a Gentile may eat the intestines of a slaughtered animal. They were severed from the animal while it was still convulsing. It appears that practically the ruling that the intestines are always permitted for a Gentile regardless of the exact method of slaughter, and they are not considered to be hanging by themselves in the body cavity for several reasons. So I would suggest that what we're getting is the practical, the final part of the 6-page footnote in the Hebrew probably goes into the impractical aspect, the theoretical aspect, whereas what we're getting here is the synopsis. Rabbinical authorities do not hold that they are considered to be hanging by themselves, totally disconnected within the body cavity. Even those who hold this opinion do so as a stringency doubt. But this does not make something forbidden for Gentiles. So this is the principle we learned learned a couple of days ago, that in the case of a doubt, for a Jewish halakha, the stringency goes the halakha goes towards the stringency when there's a doubt. In Gentile, in Noahide law, the doubt is treated in a lenient. The uncertainty goes towards the lenient side. That's just a general rule for these things. So because it's a doubt, it would not be forbidden for a Gentile. B, the entire consideration of that opinion is to say that the intestines are left like a hanging limb, which is permitted for Gentiles after the animal dies, as explained above in topic 4.1. So the straight up halakha is that a Gentile cannot eat limb from a living animal while the animal is still alive. There's a fence, a rabbinic fence, that says, well, we should not allow limb of a living animal after the animal dies. It was removed from the animal while the animal was alive. Now the animal's dead. The rabbi said we should not allow that because it might lead a person to the idea of a rabbinic fence is to say that we're going to make it more strict in order so people stay away from doing the actual violation. And so in a case like this, no one's going to be eating no one's going to be eating the innards of the animal while it's going through that state. It's in that little bit of time between the slaughter and the animal being considered acceptable for consumption. The animal's dead and now is considered acceptable for consumption. It's not practical to think someone's gonna be opening up the animal and eating the liver or eating the intestines during that tiny period of time. I mean, it's possible, but it's highly unlikely. C, the entire problem of cutting off a limb while the animal is still convulsing is only a rabbinic decree that one should not come to eat the limb while the animal is still convulsing. See topic 3.1 and footnote 71 above. In the case of internal organs, it is highly remote possibility that these parts would actually come to be eaten before the slaughtered animal has died. D, since next slaughtered animals is permitted by Torah for the Gentile, since Nick's slaughtering of animals is permitted by Torah for Gentiles. He is performing an action to permit the animal's limbs and intestines to be eaten, as opposed to the type of action which is forbidden, namely cutting limb off a living animal while it's alive. So we're seeing the fact that he's slaughtering the animal properly indicates that he's intending to do things properly, and it's not likely that he's going to, because he's doing things properly, then the rabbinic fence is not gonna, it does not need to be as strict in this case. E. Jewish slaughterers have always sold carcasses that are incorrectly slaughtered, including the intestines, to Gentiles to reduce their financial loss. This proves that the prevailing custom has been the lenient view. Otherwise, the sale of these organs to Gentiles would be forbidden for Jews due to their prohibition of putting a stumbling block before the blind. That's Leviticus 19:14. That is, before someone who is unaware, blind about a certain matter. So in this regard, the actual Torah law should not be tempered, should not be affected by custom. But in the case of a rabbinic fence, there's been a prevailing custom for centuries to, when a Jew has a difficulty with a Jewish slaughter, which is very strict as to how it has to be done, the Jew would then sell the carcass, will sell the meat to Gentiles, and the Gentiles will use the meat, and everyone's happy. And because that's been the custom for so long, we're not going to put a rabbinic fence across where a custom has been so firmly established. They're going to find other ways to put the rabbinic fence to protect all of the, it has to be done in such a way that it protects everyone's interest. The purpose of a rabbinic fence is not to make life difficult, it's actually to make life easier, so people do not inadvertently do Torah transgressions. We don't want people to mistakenly do Torah transgressions. Therefore, rabbinic fences are put up for protection, but it's not, it doesn't have to, the rabbinic fences can be moved when there's a reason to do so, and a custom would be a reason to do so. From the onset, this prohibition does not apply. Likewise, the prohibition does not apply for any glands in the neck. For example, the thymus gland that may be severed from below or above by the slaughter cut. See Megiddim Sifri Da'at 27:2, which teaches that a severed windpipe and esophagus are considered as hanging in the animal. It appears that this ruling is only in regard to the laws about invalid kosher slaughter, but not in regard to Aver Memakai. So in this case, there's issues regarding whether an animal was properly slaughtered as to where the slaughter cut goes with regard to the glands in the neck, but that does not affect, that's not a question of the prohibition against eating the limb of a living animal. It's rather a question regarding the slaughter cut, and therefore it would, the glands are not an issue. The slaughter cut is the intention to kill the animal. And so anything, the idea is not to allow people to cut. The idea is not to get people in the habit of cutting the limbs off the animal, cutting the flesh off the animal before the animal is dead, even if they plan to eat the flesh after the animal died. You shouldn't cut the animal up. However, the neck slaughter is the act of slaughter itself, and so there's no reason to consider the consequences of the next slaughter to be there's no reason to put the rabbinic fence at that point. Rabbinic fences can be moved to their logical location. They're not strict like a Torah prohibition is strict. A rabbinic prohibition has room for flexibility. Thank you.